You know, I made a video about the modern Basestar, a spindly, missile-only carrier that not only has no guns, but is made of meat, and despite any arguments in the comments, I firmly stand by my opinion that it's a stupid, dumb, bad design made by stupid, dumb, bad human wannabe robot losers. Machines should not try to be people. They should be the best machines possible and only assume a mechanical human form if they are about to style all over the meatbags a la Terminator. So the fact that the OG Basestar went through one of the most heinous downgrades of all time will never not piss me off. As such, today we'll be talking about it. A lot. Similar to the video I did on the Artemis class or the original Galactica though, I want to temper your expectations a little bit about this being specifically on the original series. There was many people that felt like they got baited, which, you know what, fair enough, I probably could have picked a better thumbnail for that one. But there just isn't enough information on the original to really make a full video just discussing the ship itself, since details, explanations, and expanded information just doesn't really exist. Like, here you go, the sum total wiki information on the ship is one chunky paragraph and 5 technical details, one of which is literally just faster than light.
Yes.
So while the first part of this video will be talking about its history in the original show, most of the rest is going to be covering the unified lore from the remastered series and the game Battlestar Galactica Deadlock. Because for those of you who don't know, the lore was sort of unified between the two shows by making the originals pre- or first Cylon War designs for the ships and stuff, and tying in as much lore as possible, while the actual storyline and everything that happened was basically pushed off into a non-canon alternate universe. There are, however, a few things that are unique to the original that I want to talk about. Before we get into things, however, introductions. Generic greetings and welcome to Science Insanity, channel dedicated to bringing my love of sci-fi and all its glory and grandeur to you, the viewer. If you end up enjoying the video, then consider leaving a like, subscribing, ringing the bell, all that, because it really does help and is appreciated, especially for a smaller channel like this that makes more niche sci-fi stuff. And with the classic begging out of the way, the OG Basestar. And my god, isn't that just a beautiful sight. You know, someone called me a brick fetishist once on Discord, and they're not wrong for entirely unrelated issues, when talking about ship designs, because I love the absolute state of colonial battlestars, and how they can charitably be described as chonky, very brick-like, a flying cinder block with guns, and I love it. But holy Jesus, man. Like, the OG Basestar looks like it was built to be an entire shipyard, battle carrier, fortress, and suburban shopping mall all in one. I feel like if I traveled around in there long enough, I'd probably find a Walmart. And I absolutely love it. Coupled with the way it has no visible engines and seems to just rotate menacingly in place while moving, makes it incredibly creepy. A common diss that I've heard by people who think the original is just off-brand Star Wars is to call the Basestar a Death Star ripoff, which is a very, very strange thing to say. You know, I mean, there's reasons for it, but it's still incredibly strange. I think it's because the Basestar is like vaguely round and has a giant laser attack that comes out the bottom. At least I think it does. I'm drawing a bit of a blank on imagery or reference for that, so I might just be like Mandela affecting my memory again, or entirely misremembering the name of the weapon, so take this with a grain of salt. I think it was like the Ravishal Pulsar, or the Pulsar Cannon, or the Pulse Gun, or something along those lines. Okay, added in by post-recording editing Psy, it was called the Mega Pulsar Gun, which is a stupid name, and it was a giant blue laser that shoots out the bottom and top of the Basestar from the center of the, like, saucer segments. I can see why people would call it a Death Star ripoff, but they're wrong. It's blue, not green. They're clearly different. Now, back to regular programming. So yeah, my brain, it might just be doing the thing again and lying to me. But the argument is dumb because the Basestar has so many unique elements that I don't think show up almost anywhere in sci-fi until years later, or are mostly consigned to books that came before. The most notable thing is the creepy way that they move without engines. It unnerves the hell out of me. Maybe it's because I saw Star Trek The Next Generation long before I ever went back to rewatch the OG Battlestar Galactica series, but the way that they move looks like a Borg cube except round, which would just be a Borg sphere. Ignore that, that was stupid. It's creepy, and it makes the Cylons way more unsettling than anything I saw in the remastered series, especially all the weird, like, humanoid meat puppet meat ship things, which were probably supposed to be creepy, but were just strange. Again, it might just be the fact that I find the Borg incredibly creepy and they give me the heebie-jeebies like nothing else, so regardless of what it is, I do really think that the way they move is just beautiful on screen. As for some of the more detail-oriented stuff that comes out of the original, the Basestar is a mix of carrier and battleship. It carries 100 defensive laser cannons and 300 cylon raiders that make up its strike force. While the laser cannons are mostly for anti-fighter duty, they can shoot at capital ships and incoming torpedoes and missiles and stuff, though they're not particularly effective, which is why the Basestar generally relies on its fighters to do most of the damage in any given battle. Mostly by kamikazeing into the exposed bridge of the Galactica because lol, lamau, it's funny to put your command and control outside the armor. Though this is something I think was more due to the budget and production issues, as we rarely see Cylon Basestars doing much of anything really. Most of the time they just launch fighters and stand there, rotate there menacingly. If it really needs to, though, it also has the 2 super pulse laser gun things, like I mentioned earlier, that come out the top and bottom. Giant beams that fire from the poles of the ship, and they're essentially meant to one-shot other capital vessels or battleships, or generally anything that the Basestar just wants to be gone right now. As for how they were used, well, we do have a somewhat concrete idea based on context clues and what we see from the series. The Cylon Empire pretty much employed them almost identically to how the actual Empire from Star Wars would deploy its Star Destroyers. Send one out on long patrols or pulling guard duty above a planet, while using its fighters to screen the main vessel and go out on further distance patrols around the system and stuff. When the Cylons needed to engage in larger battles, they would prefer to always send more than one. 3 was the golden number, assuming their mass swarms of fighters weren't enough when you had that many carriers around. Having 3 Basestars with their powerful laser batteries or their main guns would let them press targets from both flanks and the front while potentially one-shotting them if the enemy left themselves vulnerable to a hit from the main Giga Laser. Similar to the Star Destroyers as well, it's pretty much the only ship used by the Cylon Empire in its totality, and it fills every role from patrol to interception to mainline battle, even if it's really not ideally suited for it. And once again, this is most likely an issue with budget and time constraints from the era, because they probably would have done more. There was plenty of ideas and lots of very interesting things that just never got used, and well, they ended up just copy-pastaing the Basestar a whole bunch of times on screen to make a big enemy fleet, rather than coming up with anything new. Overall, though, the Basestar that we see in the original series is really, really cool, but at least in my opinion, a little bit disappointing because they don't tend to really do much. They just rotate there and look cool, and that's pretty much it for the vast majority of the series. And that brings us to the unified lore, or how the OG Basestar became one of the first truly domestic Cylon designs, rather than something they just stole from the Colonials before adding blue LEDs and new rims and calling it their own unique ship. You see, early on in the Cylon Rebellion, the Toasters had exactly dick and squat worth of ships from which to fight a war. So they did what all horrible machine revolutions do and committed unspeakable atrocities against every CPU, GPU, and SSD they could get their grubby little USB ports into. Hacking, disabling, and generally stealing everything that wasn't nailed down, like only the finest of murder hobo loot goblins before taking their ill-gotten gains, and the lore's not really clear, presumably fucking off into deep space to figure out what they were going to do next. And the way that they actually went about claiming these human ships is, kind of awful, if we can say it. Suffocating to death is a pretty terrible way to go, and the Cylons would just go for the most efficient way possible, which is hack the door controls of the entire ship, and then just open them all, including all of the airlocks. And in fact, if you actually look at a lot of the designs, the canon ones at least, that have come out of this time period from the early Cylon Rebellion, most of them look almost entirely like refit Colonial designs. So when you look at early Cylon ships, things like the Talon or the Revenant class, for example, it looks and feels like a Colonial warship. Giant broadsides, heavy armor, mediocre speed, and a pig-headed brick design. They're also literally described as being stolen or repurposed colonial ships from before the First War. Something like the Nemesis, though, is a more recent design, and what I would consider an early attempt to create a wholly unique Cylon ship, with the wing and split fin design near the center of the hull looking reminiscent of the overall wing shape of the Raider, and while it focuses almost entirely on speed and electronic warfare, carrying light armor and just one gun. The reason I bring this up is because the Cylon Basestar, the iconic design we know, was a development far later in the timeline than most people think, not only solidifying the entire design style and philosophy of the Toasters' incoming ships, but also one of the first vessels to implement new technologies and stuff into warfare. The Basestar has no visible engines, and to the unending rage of turbo nerds like me, no official explanation on how they move around, at least nothing concrete. My best guess is that the Cylons are simply far more advanced in their use of gravity manipulation than the Colonials are. We obviously see battlestars with internal gravity, and since they're not laid out like towers to use thrust gravity, we can safely assume that they have some kind of gravity floor plating to keep the people stuck to the ground. And it's not out of the question to assume that Cylons would be able to dramatically scale this tech up and make it workable as the propulsion for capital ships, especially since we see small toaster ships using regular engines all the way up to the modern Raiders. But this does beg the question, if Cylon ships use gravity to move, and we normally assign the direction of apparent gravity as downwards, does that mean every Cylon Basestar is permanently in freefall? This is such a stupid derailment, but I can't help but imagine the Toasters testing the drive for the first time, only for the entire ship and all the things inside to be affected as well, so the moment they turn on the quote-unquote engines, everything is just in freefall. Some poor Cylon Centurion desperately air swimming to try to get to a wall or something and hang on as they're moving around. It's dumb, but I had to get that idea out there because it was just living rent-free while I was writing the script. And while I know the reason Cylon Basestars rotate while moving is to constantly keep new faces towards the enemy and prevent one face from being disabled or destroyed by concentrated fire, I choose to believe that they just couldn't figure out how to make the ship not spin. They turned on the gravity engines, they fixed most of the problems, and the ship just started helicoptering, and after months of trying, they just gave up, called it a feature, and moved on from that point. But the propulsion alone wasn't the only advancement that the Basestar brought about for the Cylons. The Basestar represented a fundamental shift in doctrine from the smaller, more direct combat-oriented roles that most, if not all, Cylon capital ships followed, to something significantly different. This was, again, because they copied the gun brick style of the Colonials. But the Basestar went hard into the advantages that the machine menace possessed and did something unique. First and foremost, machines never get tired, never have to eat, and don't really care about workers' rights abuses, so long as they're the ones committing them. So leveraging their industrial potential, the Cylons can build bigger, better, faster ships at a much more rapid pace than the Colonials could ever hope to. Hence why the Basestar is absolutely enormous. This girth means that the Cylon Basestars are incredibly durable, carrying reasonable amounts of armor all around, and having a vastly more resilient structure due to their raw mass. All of that put together makes the Cylon Basestar a veritable floating fortress, impossible to outmaneuver or outflank since, well, it's round, there's no dead angles and no blind spots to exploit the same way that you can by getting behind or under a Colonial Battlestar. And when we come to the weapons loadouts and stuff like that, though, is where we really see the changes in the Cylon idea of war from the early midpoint of the first Cylon War, later on into the modern story of the remastered series. Instead of focusing on a mix of weapons systems and utility like main battery guns, fighters, missiles, and munitions launchers and stuff all working together as we see from their earlier designs, the Basestar plays to the Cylon's strengths. Those strengths being malware, missiles, and raiders. While the stupid smelly apes of the colonies were busy slapping more armor and bigger guns onto their brick-based ships, the Toasters were elegantly applying their own advantages to apparent new emerging ship technology. The Basestar isn't actually meant to engage in a right proper fight. Like, it's huge and it's very durable, don't get me wrong, but it's really not meant to be trading shots. It's meant to be that guy in every single vehicle combat game ever. You know the type. Hiding behind bushes 20 miles away, lobbing guided missiles or aim-assisted shells at you, and then zipping behind cover or sniping you in your spawn when he flanked 50,000 miles around the outside of the battlefield. You know the type. You know the exact guys I'm talking about. The Cylon Basestar doctrinally was exactly that. It was meant to hold a distance outside the effective range of colonial weapons fire, lobbing swarms of highly destructive and often nuclear-tipped missiles at incoming fleets, and it was so proficient at this job that single Basestars were reportedly capable of annihilating entire task forces of smaller or older human ships before they ever got the chance to shoot back. This was thanks to the high capacity and rapid reload missile tubes mounted along the underside or top side, I guess, depending on your perspective, of the giant dinner plates. They're on the inside of the trench thing. They're on the part that's facing its whatever. You get what I mean. The raw size of the Basestar, though, and the rotation-inclined method of movement allowed it to dump dozens of missiles into the void in seconds, and while its first salvo launchers were reloading, spin the ship around, and they fire even more missile tubes from second or third or fourth or fifth or on and on it goes, batteries of missile launchers in turn as the ship moves. And the entire time it's doing this, it's just kiting away and keeping a comfortable distance. What a miserable experience it would be to try to fight this thing in reality rather than in the relatively poorly based gameplay of Battlestar Galactica Deadlock. It's literally, surprise, 1 billion missiles to the forehead. Then you tank those and, you're finally like catching up to it and you're like, oh god, okay, I'm pretty drained, but we're almost there. We're almost in range to punch this guy in the teeth. Then it goes, surprise, 1 billion Cylon Raiders to the face. And assuming you manage to survive those, having been completely crippled as they've shot everything and anything on your ship worth a damn, from sensors to point defense guns to main cannons and more, even your engines I imagine, you thinking, okay, finally, this stupid thing has to have nothing left. The Basestar is empty, I can just run it down and kill it because it basically doesn't have guns. And then it goes, surprise, third verse, same as the first, 1 billion missiles to the face. It sounds incredibly annoying to fight. And speaking of raiders, that's the other thing, or things plural, that the Basestar is focused on. It carries hundreds of raiders in multiple hangar bays spread across the ship's upper and lower hull. The scary thing about the raiders wasn't simply the fact that they carried anti-ship missiles and were capable of doing light damage even to Battlestars. Oh no. The biggest threat the Raiders posed was due to their synergy with the oncoming wall of missiles thick enough to walk along. The perfect example of what I'm talking about was a battle over an ice planet during Operation Raptor Talon. 3 colonial Battlestars were deployed to find and destroy a Cylon research base that was believed to be developing some kind of superweapon. During the engagement over the planet, Cylon Basestars engaged the colonial task force, and the Battlestar Columbia had her flak screen crippled when Cylon Raiders broke through the defensive line of Vipers and gunfire and destroyed most of the main battery guns along the ventral side of the ship. The damage those Raiders did, while ultimately minimal and insignificant to the structure of the Battlestar itself, resulted in multiple gaps in the defensive screen and multiple nuclear missiles getting through and all but destroying the Columbia, breaking her back and sending the corpse of the Battlestar drifting off into the void. The reason that the Basestars were so deadly, the reason they were so effective and for much of the First Cylon War extremely difficult to destroy, is because they denied the Colonials their biggest advantage, a proper, straight fistfight. By keeping distance and using a mix of missiles and fighters to whittle down colonial battle groups, they could inflict disproportionate losses and, if the battle was turning against them, simply flee using their superior FTL tech. If engaged with other smaller Cylon ships, though, the Basestar was also a potent command and control craft, able to coordinate and control hundreds of raiders they themselves carried, as well as boosting the performance of any other nearby ships, increasing their maneuverability, firepower, or electronic warfare systems by offloading computational power from them, essentially networking with other Cylon vessels and using its own much more powerful computers to take over tracking and target prediction, or to calculate optimal flight paths and maneuvers. This support element served as a massive individual power boost for any accompanying vessels, as suddenly the guns on cruisers or destroyers were accurate enough to track and hit colonial ships outside their own effective range to return fire. Outgoing missile salvos were larger and more dynamic, as the Basestar would calculate gaps or weaknesses in colonial flak screens and rapidly and consistently change the flight path of the missiles as they were en route. The Battlestar may have been the Colonials' line holder and saving grace against the mechanical tide, but the Cylon Basestar was the pinnacle of the machine's strategy, and when you really boil down how it worked, it's a deceptively simple four-head-to-problem style of warfare that really encapsulates their creator's mentality of, if it's dumb but it works, it's not dumb. And that strategy was, quite simply, to inflict a disproportionate amount of attrition on the colonial war machine in every engagement that it took part in. The Basestar essentially shifted the Cylon strategy from fighting and winning battles with roughly peer ships and superior tactics towards inflicting as much disparity of losses as possible, so that every engagement they got into, whatever the Cylons lost, the Colonials would lose more in raw tonnage or numbers than they would be able to replenish before the next engagement. And since its introduction during the midpoint of the war, this strategy was working. Individual engagements began to heavily favor Cylon forces in tonnage destroyed, to the point that the Basestars began to form the totality of Cylon forces. They were so effective that they just stopped building the other smaller ships and almost entirely committed to just building the giant flying dinner plates. This strategy was probably going to win in the long run, were it not for the unprecedented success of the Colonials' Ghost Fleet offensive, followed soon after by the Cylons making breakthroughs with their hybrid program. These different events, happening roughly similarly, convinced the Cylons that the First War would most likely have been a slow, agonizing grind over decades to fully erase the colonial fleet and start pounding their planets into nuclear ash. As it so happened, they decided that an armistice would be better to rebuild their forces, create new plans, and try for a new coup de grace that might win a fight before it could ever really start. During this time, in between the First and Second Cylon War, however, the Basestar we know and love, the big chunky boy, would be relegated to backline duties and logistical work. As the modern Basestars were beginning to come online, the older design began to find its niche replaced or subverted. Overall, the Cylon Basestar represents the beginning of a new era for the Cylons, however. In the years before, they had only developed token ships and small craft, fighters and designs and stuff to prosecute their war against the useless meatbags. But the Basestar was wholly unique, entirely domestic, and designed by the machines to best suit their strengths. It's also incredibly cool looking, and the fact that it spins slowly is just, chef's kiss, fantastic. I love this thing. I love it so much that it gets a pass into the Hall of Brickitude. It may be round, but it possesses the pure brick energy of the Battlestars, and as such, gets a spot alongside them. You are granted a seat on this council, but we do not grant you the title of Battlestar. As for the actual statistics of this thing, well, we're kinda shit out of luck once again. You see, this ship has virtually no concrete statistics that I could find. We could go with the original series dimensions, but that's something like 1,800 feet or like 550 meter diameter, which, no. That would make it hilariously smaller than the average Battlestar, and based on what we see, it's hilariously larger than even the biggest colonial warships, so that one's being tossed out the window. This is one of those Stargate moments where the officially given dimensions, or at least the ones I could find, just don't make sense by comparison with everything else in the universe that was officially talked about. And we could go into some of the fan-made size comparisons, but when I looked at those ones, they put the ship at just over 3.5 kilometers in length, which, I don't think they're quite that big because holy shit, dude. So for this part, I am unfortunately going to start doing some analysis of my own, and I tend to be pretty microwave most of the time, so I wouldn't blame you for disagreeing. But if you do have any concrete sources that don't give an obviously stupid number, let me know in the comments. Now, the Deadlock video game is as close to canon as we can get without starting to speculate or make assumptions based on the original series. It's also super handy since I can just plonk the ships down next to each other and look at them, which is what I'm gonna do. And doing it this way gets us around 2,100 meters for the diameter, as it's barely longer than the modern Basestar. However, unlike the spindly spider fuck that was the excuse of a base ship in the remaster, the OG Basestar is absolutely thick. I wrote 12 C's for thick in my script, by the way, just so that you know I really meant it. When viewed from the front, though, the comparison is far more obvious with how ridiculously bigger the original Basestar is compared to the modern remaster. When you stack them up, the modern ship is a little bit less than half as tall, and that would put the original Basestar somewhere in the ballpark of 600 to 650 meters in height, and seems far more reasonable than the spindly dimensions given from the original series, which when put next to each other, the diameter is literally less than my version's height. So overall, I think that's about as close to a canon dimension or scale size whatever that we can get for the original Basestar, and I think it's very comfortable when you compare it up against other ships like the Artemis or something. This visual right here, this seems very close to what it looked like in the original, so I'm just gonna go with this. I think we're good. When it comes to offensive details, the OG is relatively light on raw firepower, only coming equipped with a few capital-grade turrets on the dorsal and ventral saucer segments. These guns perform at a relatively high level though due to the cylon's powerful computing and targeting systems, while also covering the full 360-degree arc of the ship. But their low number and lacking rate of fire means that they're disappointing even against escorts or picket ships, and utterly woeful at shooting down fighter craft. The real meat of the Basestar's potential for murder, though, is the swarms of angry hornets it carries around inside those radar dishes it calls a hull. The large cutouts spaced evenly on the top and bottom of both saucer segments are the launch corridors for the ship's hangars, so even if the Basestar gets hit with a surprise sun to the face by a cheeky colonial stealth ship, the hangars on the other side of the ship are still fully functional and ready to deploy revenge raiders. The huge number of hangars allows the Basestar to essentially dump its entire complement of over 300 small craft in minutes, made up primarily of 300 cylon raiders and supported by several dozen more heavy raiders or various other mission-dependent support craft. The OG Basestar is capable of launching enough small craft to utterly swamp most colonial fighter groups, being closer to a supercarrier by colonial standards than pretty much any of the other Cylon vessels they've seen so far. The entire structure of the Basestar's launch and recovery systems is an early echo of the modern Basestar, focusing on the rapid mass deployment of raiders in a colossal carrying capacity. When it comes to the missiles, like I talked about earlier, the OG Basestar has multiple redundant launching systems. Buried on the inside of the ship's saucer in between the launch bays, there are a number of missile batteries. There's no information on where exactly they are or what exactly they look like, but based on the in-game models that I really like, I think they look great, I choose to believe that these clusters of circular-looking things, those are the missile tubes. Together, the Basestar would have between 100 to 200 individual launch tubes that fire in volleys of a dozen or so warheads at any given time. I feel like this is similarly reasonable and a precursor to the modern Basestar, which lines up each of its prongs with a gigafuctillion missile launchers and fills the entirety of said prongs with danger pylons ready to launch. The armament of the Basestar is heavily focused on long-range combat, the experience on the receiving end of which can probably charitably be described as the moment of potent, ass-clenching regret that floods you when you walk outside and see a hornet's nest directly above the doorframe. But overall, the original saucer-segmented design of the Basestar is amazing. Whether the old or new lore, it is a beautiful ship, but I can't help but feel like the reimagined version is just cooler because, you know what? Feel free to disagree, but lasers and energy beams are just not as cool as machine gun fire rapid missiles. They just aren't. And that brings us pretty much to the end of the video. The Cylon Basestar, a beautiful craft, a wonderful brick of a warship, incredibly cool to look at, and something that in both settings pretty much defined the story in its role as the aggressor, the bad guy, the big enemy waiting at the end that's just going to slap down all contenders until the main characters get there to put them straight to hell where they belong. But before we fully end off, a few announcements since this is the first video back in a little while and Steve is still nowhere to be found, but this is going to be the last video before I start updating the visuals and kind of reworking the feel of the channel a little bit. It's been a while since I underwent the last visual update from the black and white style we had when we first started out to the motion graphics and white and blue that we have now, and I think it's about time to rework things again. It's not going to be massive, just reorganizing the motion graphics and the layout on screen and stuff so that more of the screen can actually be used to show images and videos and stuff. But there are other changes happening as well. But I will leave the big one for a surprise in another video. Maybe, I don't know. I'll tease you a little bit with it here. Here you go. You probably won't be able to figure out exactly what this is, or you're gonna do what my Discord does, and you're gonna say the wrong thing countless times because you know it'll annoy me. Anyways, before I completely end off, I want to give a huge thanks to all the members on Patreon supporting the channel. You guys have helped me move out of the fucking hellhole of a basement I lived in before into my own place, and it is just so good for my peace of mind and ability to live, with a special thanks to all the members of the $5 tier going above and beyond. David G, the original, Augie, 11 Bravo Crunchy, Terry Higgins, Pedro Munaz, David G, the other ones, Silencer, Vox Apollyon, Phoenix, BT Legend, Electroboy 11, Logan Maynard, Mickey, David Armand, Creedome, Robin Stop it, Fenrir Striker, Tachi Takane, He's Deb, Pixie, Vertus, Fabric 445, Mini Crustacean, Charles the Snep, Paulie, Eric Jones, Joseph Holiday, Zombie the Zerker, David B, Sweet B, Restro, Le Butcher, Dabby Taco, Nomquam, Brian Hall, John Gabrielle, Joshua J. Lee, The Hayfork, Unit Zero, Tarly Bob, Kiwi Warrior, Douglas Jerema, Jason Vigo, Screaming Stuka, Darius D, Exothermic Reaction, Roscoe292, Christoph Grimberg, Baron AJ, CT7274, Freedom Trooper, Steven Ventura, Zephyr Windstar, Harbinger 029, Oscar Reed, Skogan, Wolfie, and in the multiple weeks I've been away, I'm pretty sure there's a few new people. JT Frogblast, which is a great name, German Speaker, which is incredibly generic, Drewski, Heller8284, that's the second large numbered name, Angry TV Robot, which is a hilarious name and topical for the video of the day, and Tenebrarius Rade. Holy hell, I butchered that, but you know what? Confidently terrible. And with that, the video is functionally over, but something for the patrons, because I know you guys usually watch this far. The Patreon is going to be going through an update as well. I'm going to be reworking some of the patron rewards and changing things around because the patron thanks is getting a little bit ridiculous. It's taken a little bit too long at the end of every video, so some things are going to change a little bit. But with that, the video is functionally over. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope your support will continue in the future. And with that, the video's over. Outros are hard. Goodbye.